Good morning. Welcome to session 5. Today we move from the completion of the Panama Canal up until one of those watershed moments in Panamanian history, 1968. In 1968, the military took control of the nation after a coup d'etat, a golpe de Estado, that overthrew one of Panama's most illustrious statesmen, Arnulfo Arias Madrid. And so what I want to do today is to look at this process of nation building, to look at the challenges that Panama faced, the nature of their political system, the interaction between Panama and the United States, and how the United States' role in Panama was in many ways detrimental to the development of a representative constitutional government. And I'll explain why that was. In our final session next week, what I'll do is I'll look at 3 main themes: the military governance, basically from 1968 to the U.S. invasion of Panama with Operation Just Cause in 1989, the toppling of Manuel Noriega. I, from that point, will look in depth at the Panama Canal treaties, the process by which those treaties were negotiated, what they have meant for Panama, how they were implemented, both in reference to the canal zone and the canal itself. And finally, I'll look at the opening of the third locks and how that has changed the functioning of Panama's canal here in the 21st century. And that'll bring us up to the contemporary era. I think that after we finish next week, you would be able to go to Panama with great confidence, knowing that you've got a tremendous foundation and knowledge of more than just the canal itself, but about Panama from its earliest colonial period all the way up through to the present. All right, I want to begin with just a few overarching political dynamics that were at work. You know, I mentioned in our last session that Panama's autonomy was extremely limited from the time that the nation was born in November of 1903. There was a 10-mile wide canal zone which bifurcated the nation into 2 parts. Panamanians could not simply enter the canal zone without special permissions. And so there was a physical barrier. The country divided in 2. Likewise, the Panamanian economy was completely dependent on the United States by virtue of the use of the United States dollar. All fiscal policy regarding Panama was decided in the United States. And the United States, by virtue of the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty and the Panamanian Constitution, had the right at any time to unilaterally enter Panama, specifically the terminal cities of Panama City and Colón, in order to ensure tranquility and the security of the canal. And so these are extreme limitations. Now, politically, we see in the first decades of the 20th century the evolution of U.S. policy toward Panamanian politics. And my view of this is that we move early on from a relative indifference to a protective paternalism, and finally to outright domination. And there will be a number of elections held in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where invariably the United States will intervene, oftentimes at the behest of the Panamanian Conservative Party, which was the party that the United States felt most comfortable interacting with. We see U.S. political intervention through election supervision. This was true in Panama, as well as in other areas that were protectorates of the United States. For instance, Cuba. For instance, during the period of World War I and up until the good neighbor policies implemented in the early 1930s, the U.S. would also oversee elections in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti. The United States would be directly involved in the political changing of the guard as well in Nicaragua. And so what it represents is, from the outset, the U.S. placed its support behind the conservatives. The conservatives in Panama were often referenced within the country as the Rabiblancos. These were the influential, mostly white Panamanians with deep family ties, and they were the ones who dominated the first elections from the time of Manuel Amador, the physician who would be the first president of Panama, onward. There will be moments where the Liberal Party will call for open manifestations, protests, actual revolt, which will lead to the sending of United States Marines into Panama, at least on 5 occasions prior to 1926. There is one more nefarious instance of U.S. intervention in a Panama election, and that was the election of 1910. In 1910, a mulatto, a person of mixed race, by the name of Carlos Mendoza, was running on the Liberal ticket. And the United States ambassador to Panama, along with the charge d'affaires and zoning officials, came together to make certain that Carlos Mendoza stepped down, withdrew from the election, with the threat that the U.S. would directly intervene and intercede if he did not. And so there would be more overt interventions. One that comes to mind is the outright U.S. military occupation of Panamanian territory in 1918. To make it a little simpler, what I see is this recurring pattern. There are ostensibly free and fair elections that are held. When the conservatives win, and win handily, there really is no call for U.S. mediation. When the elections are close, or when it appears that the liberals will win, there we see the United States intervening. And to be clear, it's not simply that the U.S., as a large, powerful nation, was imposing its will on Panama. The Panamanians themselves were cleverly bringing in U.S. intervention. Members of the Conservative Party would often put forward that there were threats, that there was potential instability, that there was a definite need for the U.S. to mediate and to serve as a referee. So to some degree, there is culpability on the part of the conservatives in Panama, who on numerous occasions were able to manipulate the levers sufficiently to get the United States to respond in just the fashion that they hoped for, to keep them and their vested interests in power. So here we see Jose Domingo de Obadilla, who would be president of Panama from October 1, 1908 until his death. He represents the type of conservative figures that the U.S. wanted to see as caretakers in the presidential seat in Panama. His death in 1910 led to Carlos Antonio Mendoza's run on the liberal ticket. He's the very same individual that the U.S. conspired to make sure would not become president of Panama. So to reinforce some of the broader themes, I would interpret this as the conservatives in Panama playing on U.S. fears of instability, understanding that the United States clearly was concerned about the canal and the defense of the canal, and the conservatives used that to their advantage. After the completion of the canal, during World War I, there would be some 14 bases anchored in the canal zone, assuring a permanent U.S. military presence. Looking at it from the other end, the United States was hedging its bets on the Panamanian oligarchy. And likewise, the oligarchy was dependent on U.S. support to continue their election victories at the polls. Alongside these interventions and this interference, there rose, particularly in the decade of the 1920s, and it comes to full fruition in 1931 with the overthrow of the sitting government, first time in Panamanian history that a sitting president was overthrown. There was a rising popular opposition to the original treaty, to the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, to the Panamanian Constitution. There were calls for new negotiations so that the United States would be called upon to pay an even larger annual sum for the use of the canal, that the United States would allow more direct interaction from a commercial standpoint between the canal zone and Panama proper. And so what we see are minor concessions. There are a series of treaties, the first of which is completed in 1936, the Hull-Alfaro Treaty, which does provide Panama with a larger subsidy, which does allow Panamanians to sell various raw materials and particular agricultural foodstuffs to the Canal Zone Commissariat. And so these concessions are part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, which is implemented completely by 1933 in Panama. One of the key political figures, who emerges in the decade of the 1920s, he is actually a liberal politician by the name of Belisario Porras. And you see the monument to him today in Panama City. Belisario Porras was an intellectual, see, an attorney, writer, poet, professor, and was a three-time president of Panama. Early on, 1912 to 1916, 1918 to 1920, and then 1920 to 1924. He would leave his imprint. Many of the public works projects that were undertaken throughout the country were begun under Belisario Porras. Likewise, he's the one in U.S. eyes who helped to rehabilitate, to some degree, the Liberal Party, showing that liberals could run the country and not place the Canal Zone or the terminal cities in any threat. Now, we come to what for me is perhaps some of the most important history for Panama in the 20th century. I say that because this is what I primarily worked on when I lived there. And it has to do, in a larger sense, with two brothers, Harmodio and Arnulfo Arias Madrid. And they would be two of the dominant statesmen in Panamanian history throughout the 20th century. They would come to prominence in the late 20s. They would be part of these rising nationalist sentiments. They would help to overthrow the government in 1931 and usher in a whole new group of foreign-educated, upwardly aspiring middle-class Panamanians. And they would both go on to be president. Harmodio would be president of Panama from 1932 to 1936. Arnulfo's political history is far more tempestuous. He was president on 3 occasions. He was overthrown by the military or national police on all 3 occasions. He was Panama's most accomplished vote-getter. He was a populist politician. He knew how to create alliances. He knew how to get people to the polls. He knew how to win elections. It's been rightly said that he never lost an election that he ran in. The problem for Arnulfo was what happened once he became president. He had strong autocratic tendencies, wanted to rule without any consideration given to the legislative or judicial branches, wanted his own constitution, and always was attacking the wealthy and influential families in Panama, as well as on occasion the United States, along with the Afro-West Indian community in Panama. So I want to talk about these two figures because they will either be in power or the most vociferous opposition all the way from 1931 up until Arnulfo's death in 1988. In fact, it was said that the one person that Manuel Noriega was most fearful of was Arnulfo Arias. He made sure that Arnulfo would not be let back into Panama after Arnulfo had been forced into exile, for fear that people would immediately go into the streets to support him. And so, we come to this moment in the late 1920s where we see the rise of a nationalist group known as Acción Comunal. They were made up of a number of professionals, aspiring members of the middle class who had gone abroad to get their degrees in law or medicine. Many of them were engineers. Some of them were university professors. For instance, Harmodio Arias left Panama to study at the London School of Economics. He was one of the key litigators that helped to put together the whole Alfaro Treaty of 1936, which is also known as the Arias-Roosevelt Treaty. So he was a famous barrister attorney. Arnulfo left Panama to come to the United States, where he studied both at the University of Chicago and he got his medical degree at Harvard University. So these are the types of folks who made up Acción Comunal. They were from middle and lower middle class families. They felt in the political sphere that they had hit a glass ceiling, that they were unable to play the kind of roles that their education and that their talents warranted, so they decided to do something about it. And the thing that they did was to overthrow the sitting president, Florencio Armodio Arizomena. That name Arizomena in Panama represents one of the most well-to-do and influential families. So this marks what's known as the political action of the generation of 31. And it's a phenomenally interesting story. One of the things that I did in my research was to figure out exactly how the government was overthrown, what took place. And rather than go through every twist and turn that I've written about, as much as I'd like to, let me just say that the idea was this. The attack on the presidential palace would happen right around the new year, when there are festivities in the street, when people are firing off fireworks, with the idea that kind of the break in the routine would help to serve as camouflage for the actual overthrow of the president. So it was a three-pronged approach. Part of this group, and it was a secret society, so they were very careful about who was part of the organization. They had what they called their temple, where they met. And so they had the plans and they were ready to go forward. Harmodio Arias, the older brother, at the 11th hour said that he thought this action would trigger a U.S. intervention, and he didn't want anything to do with it. Some of the other figures within the organization at the top believed that the plans may have been compromised, and so they got cold feet. The key figure who comes to the fore then is the irrepressible Arnulfo Arias. And Arnulfo said, doesn't matter who is dropping out, I'm going ahead, and I'm actually going to lead the attack on the presidential mansion, presidential palace. So a three-pronged attack. They attack the main police barracks within Panama City simultaneously. They attack the instruments for dissemination of news, radio stations, and they attack the presidential palace. It's a long story, but what Arnulfo did prior to the attack, right near the presidential palace in Panama City, are other large structures. Arnulfo had gotten the key to one of those buildings, which is very close to the presidential palace. He was able to let him and some of the insurgents in, and there came a point where he literally leapt from the balcony of an adjacent building into the presidential palace. So the fighting takes place within the palace, several-hour gun battle, and when it's over, Florencio Armodio Arizomena, in his study, realizing he's under assail, signs a letter of resignation. The coup succeeds. In short order, Armodio Arias, the older brother, is made interim president. And once the Panamanian ambassador to the U.S., Ricardo Holta Alfaro, returns, he becomes the acting president up until elections could be held in 1932. Armodio Arias wins those elections and begins an important presidency. It's under Armodio Arias that the University of Panama is founded. He's the one that negotiates with many of the labor unions within Panama to provide them with better salaries and better working conditions. And so he gained a tremendous amount of goodwill. In fact, the United States very much liked Harmodio Arias. They felt he was very cerebral, that he was temperate in his demeanor, that he was modest. There are a number of famous photos of Harmodio with FDR. While president, Harmodio sends his younger brother, this force of nature, Arnulfo, to Europe. And he's the minister plenipotentiary representing Panama in Germany, in Italy, and in Spain. Think about that. Mid-1930s, who is Arnulfo interacting with? Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Francisco Franco. Got a heavy dose of authoritarianism, fascism. Arnulfo returns, and the Arias family believed that he was ready to run on his own in 1940. And that begins his chaotic political career, unlike any other. I remember when I was writing about him in a work on populism in Latin America, I actually put together a scorecard to look at the number of times he was president, the number of times he was overthrown, the amount of time, the number of years he spent in exile overseas, the amount of time he spent in jail, the amount of time that the number of times he ran for the presidency and actually won at the polls and wasn't allowed to actually serve. So phenomenal figure, and an important one. So this is Acción Comunal, the rather unusual insignia of the organization. And here is a group photo just months before the actual overthrow. And again, it's the first time in Panamanian history, January of 1931, that a sitting government was violently toppled by a coup. This captures the spirit of what the movement was all about. It was ardent nationalism. Think about it. Panama was faced with a great challenge. What did it mean to be Panamanian? Who was Panamanian? What are the qualities and characteristics? Panama gained its independence in a very unusual manner, to say the least. And so there was an attempt to arouse nationalist passions and patriotism. And so some of the rallying cries for the organization were speak Spanish, count in Balboas. That was an alternate term for US dollars. Paper currency was US currency. But any of the coins were Panamanian coins, and they were known as Balboas, saying speak Spanish and count in Balboas. The hope here was to develop sentiments of love for country, to really ennoble the nation and make people proud of being Panamanian. And so this was what Acción Comunal set out to do, and it's what Arnulfo Arias really took to heart when he became president. So there they are. To the left, Harmodio, Arias, Madrid, and to the right, the one and only Arnulfo Arias. You know, I've had the good fortune over many years to live and work in different places in Latin America. And there are, in various countries, these galvanizing figures that people either love and worship and exalt or absolutely detest. And Arnulfo Arias is one of those, without any doubt. You can still go to various places, private homes in Panama, and folks will have a photo of Arnulfo, as he's belovedly referred to. In fact, he represents populism in the sense that even after he died, the movement continued onward. As often happens with populist movements in Latin America, you simply take the person's name and put ismo-ism on the end, and you have Arnulfismo. And it's this eclectic political philosophy. It's one of the things about populists. They're not really consistent. Populists can be left of center, they can be right of center. The qualities of a populist are hard to identify, but one of the things that most of them have is a charismatic bond with the people. They can mobilize people and channel their energies for political purposes. Some of them are seen as exceptional. They may be exceptional for their level of charity. They may be exceptional because of their perseverance. Look at some of the populist figures in Latin America. They come to power, they're overthrown, they're jailed, they're exiled, they come back. That's Arnulfo. Unbowed. Some are phenomenal speakers. One of the great populists from Ecuador said, "Give me a balcony and I'll capture the people. That's all I need." And so each of them have different and various skills. Some are seen as being, again, very generous, sort of the Eva Perón idea of a populist leader. But Arnulfo was a nationalist, Arnulfo was a populist. Phenomenal vote getter, put together all kinds of political alliances. Once in power in 1940, he attacks the oligarchy, he attacks the United States, he attacks and actually rescinds the citizenship of all Afro-West Indians in Panama. His 1941 Constitution took away the citizenship of Afro-West Indians born in Panama. It's one of the things that I'm working on right now. As far as I know, there are only 2 cases in Latin America. And one of them's happening right now. 2 cases where a nation has taken away citizenship that was gained through birth. It happened in Panama, and the only reason that it ended was that Arnulfo was overthrown. And the other instance is here today in the Dominican Republic, where people of Haitian descent, born in the Dominican Republic, are having their rights of citizenship rescinded and are being supposedly repatriated to Haiti, when in most cases they've never spent one day in Haiti in their lives. They have no ties, many. But what's amazing about Arnulfo is, despite his antagonistic attacks, in later years he would actually forge alliances with the Panamanian military, with the United States. In 1968, he runs in an alliance that has Afro-West Indian support, if you can imagine that. You have to be a political magician to be able to do that. And he was able to do it time and again. He ran in 1984 against the candidate who was handpicked by Manuel Noriega and won. course, they weren't going to let him return and actually serve as president. So a phenomenal, phenomenal figure. Here's one of the famous photos of Harmodio Arias. Again, someone who the U.S. felt that they could interact with. And the thing is, you know, Arnulfo's tempestuous, he's willful, and Harmodio is just the opposite. Extremely thoughtful, methodical, very low-key. And as brothers, they didn't always get along. Harmodio, in 1941, actually supported the overthrow of his own brother. Absolutely. The other thing that's important to mention is that the Arias Madrid brothers, also the family, became owners of the Panama America newspaper. What an important political platform to have. Can you imagine, as politicians, whether you're in power or you're the opposition, you've got your own widely read newspaper, seen as one of the best newspapers, even today, in Panama, because of the quality of the writing and the reporters that they bring on. But obviously, it could be used, especially in the editorial pages, to serve as a voice for the Arias Madrid family's interests. Arnulfo Arias, president, June 1940 to October 1941. His second presidency, a little bit better, stays almost twice as long in office, November 1949 to May 1951. And then the most remarkable of all, one that I've written about, his 11-day presidency in October of 1968, when he's swept aside by the military. The photo at the left is when he became president in 1940. He's there with Belisario Porras to show that there was unity from a political standpoint in Panama. And at right, it is a newspaper photo of Arnulfo Arias on trial. Here's what happened. Give you the quick rundown on both of his overthrows. In 1941, Arnulfo Arias, upon becoming president, puts forward and rams through the legislature his own constitution. In that constitution, citizenship rights for Afro-West Indians were rescinded. Strict limitations were placed on immigration to Panama. There were many in Panama who saw this constitution as a way for him to centralize authority under his mantle as president. They were beginning to call him the Creole Führer, in reference to Adolf Hitler, the Führer in Germany. And his autocratic tendencies worried the United States. And so what took place and sealed his fate, remember, 1941, why is that year significant? That's the year the United States enters World War II. And one of the things that happened as the U.S. was moving toward an active participation in the war prior to the Japanese attack was that the U.S. was making the necessary plans to fully utilize the Panama Canal for war purposes. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt put forward to Arnulfo Arias the U.S. needs, Arnulfo turned around and said, well, we'll need to negotiate these. Not in a time of war. The United States was not in a position where it felt anything of the sort was negotiable. So it was clear that Arnulfo's days were numbered. And so Arnulfo leaves in October of 1941 using an alias and in disguise to fly from Panama to visit his mistress in Cuba. Panamanian authorities tipped off the U.S. that he, the elected president, had vacated his office by leaving the country in an illegal fashion. He used his mother's maiden name as his surname and thought that he could get away with it. And guess what? While he was gone, his role as president was rescinded. He was replaced by a member of his cabinet that was completely willing to allow Panama to open up all of its territory to U.S. military bases and to allow the United States to do whatever was necessary in order to carry forth the fight in the Second World War. Arnulfo returns and assumed that he could either talk his way back into power or that he could organize an insurgent movement that would restore him to power. Neither of those things happened. These were extraordinary times. You're in the midst of World War II. Arnulfo Arias was seen by the United States as an unnecessary irritant and someone who could be potentially very dangerous. So that's his first fall from grace. The second is more amazing still. In the second case, Arnulfo Arias wins the election of 1948, without any doubt. The Panamanian police do not allow him to take the presidential sash. There's a quick recounting of the votes, and it was deemed that Arnulfo had lost. The other candidate becomes president and dies shortly thereafter. And there is then a revolving door at the top where the police put into power people that they think will be amenable to the rise of a National Guard, and they all prove to be inept or problematic in other ways. So Jose Antonio Ramon, who was the head of the National Police and who was an implacable enemy of the Arias Madrid family, actually turns to Arnulfo in November of 1949 and says, I am turning to you to give you the presidency under certain conditions. The country then does a recount of the votes of 1948, and it's determined that Arnulfo won by 2,544 votes. So he becomes president. Immediately, Arnulfo, being Arnulfo, goes back into attack mode. A new constitution had been created in 1946. He removes it and puts his old constitution in 1941 back in place. He rules without any consideration of the legislature or the judicial branch. And so we come to a moment where there are those who are complaining. There are public demonstrations against his presidency. He consolidates power more and more in his small coterie of advisors. And so the legislature puts forward steps to remove him from office. Jose Antonio Ramon, the head of the police, calls and says, Arnulfo, please, back down, play ball with us, we'll be able to work through this. Arnulfo refused. Ramon then sends two of the top brass from the National Police to the presidential palace. To this day, it's unclear exactly what happened, but shots rang out, and both of those top members of the National Police were killed in the presidential mansion. Arnulfo Arias, after an extended gun battle, finally emerges from the presidential mansion and was placed under arrest. He was put on trial for murder. He was put on trial for misuse and abuse of the Presidency of Panama, and he refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction. And so he infamously sat there with his back to the judge every day in court and read Kon-Tiki. Said, I'm going to read about adventures and take myself away from all of this. Well, he was found guilty. He was put in prison at the Modelo Central Prison in Panama City, and he actually caused problems from there. He went on a hunger strike. He's finally released and goes into exile. In fact, he had gone into exile after his first overthrow in 1941. And I wanted to follow his trail. Guess where he ends up? Remember, he had been in Europe during the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. He leaves in 1941 and goes to Argentina and watches the rise of Juan Perón. These are not exactly the mentors that you would want to be a head of state who's willing to show a little bit of flexibility. So, Arnulfo's political base comes from these folks. Those who felt a frustration with the United States, those who spoke about what's known, and this was a movement that Arnulfo created, known as Panameñismo, what it means to be Panamanian. Panama for Panamanians. Speak Spanish, count in Balboas. And so this is who Arnulfo was. This was really his core. Yes, he made adjustments in order to win elections, but this is what he's all about. And he was, without question, Panama's most effective vote getter since the election of 1940. I mean, there are those who would argue and say he ran in '64 after his family had made a deal with those in power in Panama so that he could return. He ran. By what I could see from the materials in the presidential archives in Panama, he won that election. He definitely won in 1984. I am not aware of any election that he didn't win. Now, aside from that, his presidencies were always ones that required everyone to fasten their seatbelts, because every day there were new decrees, there were things that, you know, he was very unpredictable. And, you know, I listened to many of his speeches, and it was amazing that he was as beloved as he was, because he used to take many of the Panamanians, the Panamanian public, to task. He'd go out on the stump campaign trail, and he'd come to some small village, and he'd be haranguing the crowds and giving a speech. And just in an impromptu way, he'd kind of look over and say, "My goodness, you're still here? I saw you 10 years ago in the same place, and you don't look any better than you did then." And people loved it, you know. Arnulfo, one and only. And so this is part of his first presidency. And then the second presidency that I talked about, the shift in political power toward the military, Jose Antonio Ramon would actually install himself as head of state after Arnulfo was overthrown in 1951. But it wouldn't last very long. Ramon actually was assassinated when he went to the horse races in Panama City, and the Arias Madrid brothers were actually temporarily considered co-conspirators, though no evidence was ever shown for that. There have been accusations that it was a Cosa Nostra or a mafia hit. Lucky Luciano, who wanted to run drugs through Panama, wanted to get rid of Jose Antonio Ramon, who also was involved in all kinds of illicit businesses despite being the head of the Panamanian National Police. So Ramon would meet a grisly end. I mean, he was killed by machine gun fire at the horse races. And so Arnulfo, as I said, with his autocratic tendencies, just some things, some specifics, you know. So he jailed any of the opposition, and particularly former presidents from the other party, closed newspapers, except for his own. But even then, there were occasions where he shut down his own family's Panama America. And he told his brother Harmodio, back off. He suspended the Constitution, and he did that with impunity. I mean, he would just give a presidential address and say, by the way, the Constitution that we've been operating under is no longer in effect, and we will now use my Constitution from 1941. And on numerous occasions, he attempted to dissolve the legislature, the National Assembly, telling them that their work was no longer needed in Panama. So I mentioned the shootout in the presidential palace. You know, this Palacio de las Garzas, the presidential palace, has seen a lot of action. You know, 1931, there's a gun battle. 1951, an even bigger one. And so, but this second toppling of Arnulfo really begins to foretell what's about to happen. It's the shadow of the military in Panama, and it's not too far. Ramon kind of tinkers with it, but by 1968, that becomes solidified. This is one of the most famous photos. This is Arnulfo emerging from the presidential palace after the gun battle, saying famously, "Volveremos, we will return." And he told everyone, "I'll be back." And he would be, absolutely. But you can see there, as defiant as ever. So, one of those critically important episodes. This rising nationalism that was embodied in Arnulfo's movement manifested itself in another way with the flag incident of 1964. The flag incident of 1964 is the first time when Panama breaks diplomatic relations with the United States. And it was over the issue of flying the Panamanian flag in the Canal Zone. A deal had been reached under President John F. Kennedy that would allow the joint flying of both the United States and Panamanian flags at major facilities in the Canal Zone. But despite the fact that that agreement had been reached, there was no impetus within the Canal Zone to actually carry it out. And so, in various spots, Panamanians attempted to come and forcibly fly their flag. And it was met with violence. And the most infamous case happened at Balboa High School in the Canal Zone, where a number of Panamanian students had come from the University of Panama to raise the Panamanian flag. And a scuffle broke out, the flag was torn, and it led to literally weeks of sniper fire, of battling back and forth all along the Canal Zone itself. The United States military was mobilized for fear of attacks on the zone itself, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. So the clash was over flying the Panamanian flag. There were obviously differences of opinion as to whether that should be allowed. Department of Defense and the State Department had different views. Zonians, of course, were defiant in not wanting the Panamanian flag flown in the Canal Zone. And so there was a continued restricted presence of the Panamanian flag. And so the incident comes to the fore on January 9, 1964, when, as I said, the Panamanian flag is torn. The Panamanian students who had come into the zone to fly it were beaten up. And it led to widespread violence, vandalism, and rioting. The Panamanian president at the time, Roberto Chiari, broke diplomatic relations with the United States, claiming that the U.S. reaction to the rioting and to the unrest all along the Canal Zone was really heavy-handed. As he said, it was a disproportionate amount of firepower, and it represented an unjustifiable aggression. He didn't believe that there needed to be tanks and that there needed to be soldiers with heavily armed patrolling the perimeters and actually moving into Panama itself. And this would mark a time where, Panamanians, this rising nationalism, the street that runs right in front of the Canal Zone in the main area of Panama City used to be called John F. Kennedy Avenue. And it was renamed after this to the Avenue of the Martyrs for those who died in this struggle. So this event, at least for me, serves as a catalyst because it is exactly in 1964 and then in the subsequent years thereafter that the U.S. and Panama begin to seriously negotiate what become the Panama Canal Treaties. The Panama Canal Treaties would come to fruition, as you'll see next week, in 1977. But their genesis is right after this flag incident in 1964. President Lyndon Johnson said, we need to come up with something better than what we currently have. This cannot continue. So this brings us to and I'm on time, so I had to stop and think for a minute. I'm actually on time. Wow. All right, so this brings us to 1968. The 11-day presidency of Arnulfo Arias. So how does this happen? He runs in 1968. The military, the Panamanian National Guard, had sworn that it would do everything in its power to make sure that he did not become president again. But he won by such a large landslide that there was no way to steal the election from him. So Arnulfo was called in. He meets with all of the top officials within the military. And they said, look, we have to find a modus operandi. How are we going to interact? And the military told him, we will give you a relatively free hand if you do not embarrass us, if you do not work against us, and if in general you simply leave us alone. That wasn't going to happen. Let me give you an example. Day one, at the inauguration, the military had planned to have a parade and celebration on behalf of the new president. And Arnulfo Arias is a no-show. Then, in day three, he announces that the top brass in the National Guard would all be sent abroad for further training. He's trying to get them out of Panama. And he's trying to claim that it's in their best interests, that they will come back far more knowledgeable about how to deal with potential insurgencies. And that's when a small coterie of non-commissioned officers, led by Omar Torrijos, plot his overthrow. And they said, this time we can't wait to see what he's going to do next. We have to act. And we have to act quickly. And that's exactly what they did. And this time they used overwhelming force. And so what fascinated me is I had the opportunity to interview some of those closest to Arnulfo, who helped facilitate his escape. And one of those peoples was his personal driver. And he told me about how they were trying to get out of the presidential mansion. Here he is racing through back streets, trying to figure out that the Panamanian National Guard probably has the most obvious roads already blocked because they wanted to take him into custody. And so this driver came up with the most convoluted way possible to drive and get into the Panama Canal zone, which was safe territory. And that's what they did. And so Arnulfo arrives in the canal zone. He tells U.S. authorities, I have been overthrown. I'm the legitimately elected president of Panama, and I expect that you're going to help me get back into power. And U.S. officials said, we kind of need to see how this is going to play out. And so Arnulfo was a very unwelcome guest for several weeks. And he then began to tell U.S. officials, if you all can't facilitate my return, I will call for a mass uprising of my supporters, and we will take power back. And so he attempted to do that, thinking that he would have an insurgency movement stemming from the territories of David and Chiriquí provinces up close to the Costa Rican border, and that they would slowly but surely take power. But it actually fizzled out. Omar Torrijos and his supporters within the military quickly were able to take control of the situation and put themselves in control of Panama. And thus begins a major moment now. This is the first military takeover. It's one of a number that are happening throughout Latin America. You know, one of the challenges in looking at modern Latin America is, so how do you teach a coherent narrative about all these different countries without just doing parallel histories? And one of the ways is to look at certain things like the rise of populism, the rise of the national security states. Most of these national security states arise within the Cold War, and they were designed to many of the militaries in Latin America were no longer worried about fighting a war coming from outside with one of its neighbors, but instead it was now all about counterinsurgency, how to root out and immunize the country from communism. And so we see military governments take over in Brazil. We see military governments take over in Argentina. We see military governments take over in Chile. We see the military take over in Uruguay. We see the military take over in Panama. Okay? And all of these, check it out sometime. When these militaries take over in the various countries, they have a shelf life of about 20 years. And then they're out. Brazil, 20 years, 1964, 1985. Argentina, roughly the same. Chile, a little longer, because there was one person in power, Augusto Pinochet. Panama, 20 years, right? Arnulfo's overthrown 1968. Manuel Noriega is out in 1989. Right around 20 years. So this is Arnulfo, October 1, 1968, preparing himself to take the presidential sash. And here we see on October 12th, at the bottom, Omar Torrijos announcing to the nation that the Panamanian National Guard had taken control of the executive branch and that the country was now in the hands of the military. Finally, we see Omar Torrijos, and I'll look at all of this in much greater depth next week, foster his own cult of personality to some degree, allowing the military to be a vehicle for upward advancement for many of the marginalized sectors of Panamanian society. So the military actually wins tremendous goodwill, including from a street urchin such as Manuel Noriega. And then here is Omar Torrijos with his famous statement after he consolidates power. He says, "I don't want to enter history. I want to enter the Canal Zone." And that really captured, you know, his own populist nationalist tendencies. And so that's our look at Panama from the completion of the canal and the early years of the nation's politics up until the moment when the military takes charge in 1968. So let me open it for questions. Anything that you might have. Yes?
What was happening in the neighboring countries, most notably Colombia?
Okay, well, you know, in Colombia you sort of had a moment of stasis. So Colombia was fairly stable from the standpoint that they had a system whereby one party would follow the other in power. And it worked very well early on, until we see a populist figure in Colombia, Jorge Gaitan, who is shot and assassinated on the streets. And Colombia, Bogotá in particular, erupts in violence. And that begins in Colombia what's known as la violencia, the period of violence. And unfortunately, it doesn't end there. It morphs into the narcotraficantes and into the rise of irregular military groups within Colombia, and has continued forward to the present. And it's fascinating. If you look at some of the folks who were there when Jorge Gaitan was killed at the Bogotazo, Fidel Castro was there as a student representative. They were having a major international gathering of student organizations and labor organizations. And Jorge Gaitan was from the lower class in Panama, in Colombia. He was beloved, and his assassination kind of ruptured what had been this relative stability, or apparent stability, but where there were these very passionate undercurrents in Colombian society. And so Colombia from that point on would have these recurring cycles. You know, one of the figures that we'll look at next week who most directly interacts with Colombia is Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega will make various deals with people like Pablo Escobar to move Colombian cocaine through Panama. Many of the wealthiest Colombians launder their money in Panama City, building these massive structures when they have no desire to occupy them or to use them. They're simply built for money laundering purposes. And so it's an interesting relationship there. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I'm wondering how life for the average person was under the military. Did they rule in a sort of dictatorial fashion, or did they support the Constitution, or what?
I've had a theory that the military in Panama operated a little bit differently from what you see in Argentina and in Brazil, where you had what were known as the dirty wars, where you had major sweeps of the population, people who are incarcerated, who are tortured, who disappear. In Panama, that doesn't happen in the way that it did in Argentina and Brazil. In Panama, what Torrijos and Noriega do is they have very focused and honed symbolic acts of violence. So key figures who are leaders of the opposition that everyone knows, their deaths, their disappearances create a quelling effect in Panama. So whereas if you look at the number of people who are killed by the military or who disappear or who are tortured, in Panama it's far less. But they're usually high-profile, prominent individuals. And their sufferings send out a message that resonates with the rest of the population. And I can tell you all kinds of phenomenal stories. You know, there's one of the leaders within the liberation theology movement in Panama was a priest by the name of Hector Gallego. And Noriega basically had his goons arrest the priest. They put him on a helicopter and flew out over the Atlantic and threw him off. And there are a number of other cases, but these are usually high-profile individuals whose death or disappearance would send a message that would emanate widely. Yes?
I was just wondering, at that time period, CIA was active with Chile.
Yes.
So in the overthrow, was the CIA involved at all with the Panamanian military overthrow?
Yeah, well, they would be. I mean, one of the things that you'll see next week is Manuel Noriega was on the CIA payroll for well over 2 decades, which was one of the great embarrassments. You know, so here you have President Bush, Bush 1, who orders the invasion of Panama, knowing, because he had been the CIA director, knowing well that Manuel Noriega had been on the CIA payroll, had won numerous commendations for his efforts to interdict drugs into Panama. I mean, there are famous photos of Manuel Noriega receiving these awards from the DEA. And at the same time, there are Colombian drug labs operating in the Darien. What Noriega will be able to do perhaps better than anyone else in Panama's history is to play both ends against the middle. No sense of any kind of political ideology or agenda in that sense. And that's often the case for many of the populists as well. But with Noriega, whoever was willing to send him money, he was willing to work with. And so at the same time that he was supporting U.S. efforts to bolster the Contras in Nicaragua, he was also working to help the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega. He was meeting and communicating with Fidel Castro at precisely the moments when the United States wanted him to distance himself from those who were seen as enemies of the United States. But that was Noriega. He thought that he could do that indefinitely. And he did it for an awfully long time. And in interviews I've done with those who were closest to him, he always used to say, you know what? I've got Teflon. And that Teflon comes from the CIA. And I've earned it. They've been paying me for years. They're not going to touch me. I will be able to get away with this. And for a long time he did. He finally overstepped his bounds, but he got away with playing both sides against one another and him being the primary beneficiary. And we'll look at all of that in great detail next week. Fantastic.